Buenos días. Vamos a dar comienzo a la actividad, finalmente. Bienvenidos y bienvenidos a la Universidad del Sagrado Corazón. Durante la mañana de hoy tenemos una actividad muy interesante. Es parte del desarrollo profesional de la Facultad de la Universidad del Sagrado Corazón, pero hemos invitado al público en general porque entendemos que es un tema de actualidad que es pertinente para todas y para todos. En particular, esta actividad es parte del 25 aniversario de las 3 maestrías pioneras de esta casa. Esas maestrías son en el área de Relaciones Públicas, en el área de Sistemas de Información y Tecnología Educativa y en el área de Gerencia de Sistemas de Información, que son los que están celebrando en el día de hoy su 25 aniversario. Antes de empezar la actividad propiamente, tengo que hacer una serie de anuncios muy importantes. Lo más pertinente para nosotros es que esta actividad se está transmitiendo en directo a través de Ustream y se va a estar retransmitiendo en Ustream también y en YouTube. Para acceder a ellos pueden entrar a la página de Sagrado, maestría25.sagrado.edu, y pueden ver entonces ahí las retransmisiones. Para los colegas que nos están siguiendo en directo, pues ya están conectados. Además de eso, quiero agradecer a un montón de gente que hace posible que estas actividades fluyan en el ciberespacio, particularmente a los colegas camarógrafos que desde anoche están con nosotros, Emily Borges, Joan Rodríguez y los que están hoy, Nelson Santana y Alberto de la Vega. Además de eso, coordinadores en el área como son Sonia Carmona, Beni Rosa, Nelson Fuentes, José Milet, César Calderón, que entre el área del Departamento de Educación, el CRI y el SECTEC logran que en un esfuerzo colaborativo podamos tener este tipo de actividades. Lo otro que quería decirles es que en una encuesta que se hizo a la facultad logramos el 100% de participación, con lo cual les agradezco muchísimo, y además es la primera vez en mi vida en cualquier tipo de investigación que yo he hecho que hemos logrado 100% de participación. Así es que si no lo han hecho ya, recojan su brazalete, que es un pendrive que le estamos dando como obsequio por haber participado en esta actividad. Bueno, hemos dicho eso, retomemos el tema. Durante la mañana de hoy vamos a estar en una actividad muy importante, como ya había dicho. Vamos a estar hablando de unos ejes centrales del mundo contemporáneo, que es el manejo de información. En el tema de las maestrías y particularmente en el aniversario de Gerencia de Sistemas de Información, esto es un tema crucial. Por un lado, el manejo ético de las tecnologías emergentes; por otro lado, destrezas de comunicación e información que todos debemos manejar y que en el área de gerencia de sistemas de información es imprescindible. Para darles una bienvenida formal, les voy a dejar con nuestra decana de Asuntos Académicos y Estudiantiles, la doctora Lidia Espinet.
Muchas gracias, Maritere. Buenos días, todos y todas. Bienvenidos a la Universidad del Sagrado Corazón. En el marco del 25º aniversario de nuestras 3 maestrías pioneras en la Universidad del Sagrado Corazón y de la celebración de los 130 años del proyecto educativo de Sagrado Corazón, celebramos esta actividad de desarrollo profesional para nuestra facultad e invitados. Nos convocamos hoy aquí para replantearnos el porqué de la educación, cómo debe ser el proceso de enseñanza-aprendizaje y cómo acercarnos al estudiante del siglo XXI. Muy detalladamente, ayer el doctor Harry Lewis nos preguntaba, ¿qué curso ha dejado una impresión en nuestros estudiantes? Probablemente ninguno, porque los contenidos se olvidan muy pronto. Pero sí, ¿qué profesor ha marcado para siempre a un estudiante? Probablemente todos, porque aquel profesor que nos inspira no se olvida a través del tiempo, ese permanece para siempre. Así que debemos preguntarnos cómo nos acercamos a nuestros estudiantes, qué metodología usamos para enseñarles, cómo debemos atenderle en la sala de clase. Así que con ese pensamiento les dejo. Quiero agradecer infinitamente al Decanato Asociado de Estudios Graduados la colaboración para la organización de esta actividad y particularmente a la licenciada Carmen Cintrón, por cuya iniciativa nos visita el doctor Harry Lewis, antiguo decano de la Universidad de Harvard. También quiero agradecer al panel reactor que hoy va a responder a la lección magistral que nos ofrece el doctor Harry Lewis. El panel reactor, como lo tienen en el programa, es la doctora María Teresa Martínez, decana asociada de estudios graduados, la profesora Silvia Álvarez, directora del Centro para el Enriquecimiento a la Docencia de nuestra universidad, y la licenciada Carmen Cintrón, profesora del programa graduado de Gerencia de Sistemas de Información. Gracias a todos por su presencia en esta mañana. Buenos días.
Buenos días a todos y a todas. Gracias a la doctora María Teresa Martínez y a la doctora Lidia Espinet por esas palabras. Yo quiero, primero que nada, hablar un poquito sobre nuestro invitado. Tienen su biografía, se les hizo llegar, pero hemos trabajado unos detalles adicionales para que le conozcan un poco mejor. Y en un momento dado voy a cambiar en inglés para que el doctor Harry Lewis pues, esté un poquito al tanto de lo que estamos diciendo acerca de su persona. El doctor Harry Lewis lo conocimos a través del Internet, en una conferencia que presentó la Universidad de Cornell, auspiciada por Educos, sobre un tema similar al que nos va a presentar en el día de hoy. No lo conocí en persona, pero me llamó la atención su preparación, ya que es una de las primeras personas que obtuvo un doctorado en matemática aplicada en el área de cómputos, en el 1974 en la Universidad de Harvard. Pero más que eso, cuando empecé a investigar un poco sobre la persona del doctor Harry Lewis, encontré que no solamente es un profesional en el área de la informática, de las ciencias de cómputos, sino que es un humanista. Y ahí obviamente se cerró la puerta a la selección del invitado para el 25 aniversario de nuestra maestría en gerencia de sistemas de información, porque esa es la aspiración que tiene esta universidad en la formación de los profesionales en el área de informática, que primero sean personas sobre las premisas humanistas y luego utilicen la tecnología como una herramienta para el desarrollo y la evolución de construir una mejor sociedad, que es parte de nuestra misión fundacional. Así que le voy a cambiar un poquito el inglés y me excusan en ese sentido. Dr. Harry Lewis studied his pre-college at Rexbury Latin School in Boston. This is the oldest school in the Americas, in the United States, been in operation since 1645. As the title says, it's a Latin school. So when I asked him yesterday what had made him such an idealist and a humanist, he said first, my schooling, not at Harvard, at Roxbury, and then my wife. So it's a story, my first, my wife, and then my schooling. So I told him, in Puerto Rico, we usually say that we women are the power behind the throne. So he agreed with me on that. As you know, he finished his bachelor's in math and physics, and in 1974, his PhD in applied math. His counselor was a philosopher, not a mathematician, not a pure mathematician. Over 30 years, he has been a computer science teacher, and he'll tell you in a little while which two have been students of him that we all know about. He is a Gordon McKay Award. For those of us who didn't know who Gordon McKay was, he was a Massachusetts entrepreneur and a Harvard benefactor from the 19th century. Dr. Lewis was Dean of Harvard College from 1995 to 2003. This post as Dean of Harvard College is more or less the equivalent as what we have in Sagrado. He was in charge of all the undergraduates. So he was the person that made sure that those undergraduates felt at home at Harvard and that they tried to graduate with the mission and philosophy of Harvard. He is the author of several books, but two of them, and the mix in between those two books was one of the reasons why we decided to bring him to Sagrado. One of them is Excellence Without a Soul. Does liberal education have a future? We yesterday had the opportunity to exchange views with Dr. Lewis about his insight in this sense, and that stresses that he still is an idealist that thinks that we should work towards making sure that the utopia we want the world to be is a feasible achievement. And he's also very aware that we should develop people with social responsibility. So he has that adequate mix or balance in between the classics and the technology. He thinks, and he is also, he has been also, an example of the issue of knowledge sharing, for helping others to make the world a better world and to evolve society into a more just society. With those words, I leave you with Dr. Harry Lewis.
Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction, and thanks to everyone who's been so hospitable to me here during these last few days that I've been in Puerto Rico. I've really enjoyed my stay, and I hope to come back. So thank you all very much. Last night I gave a talk where I talked about that information utopia and its importance to the future of the world and the future of democratic process in particular. And how many of you were there last night, just so I can get a gauge? Okay, just a handful. Okay, so when I do my little quiz things, anybody of you who just put your hand up is not allowed to answer the questions, okay? We understand the ground rules here? Okay. I talked about a number of threats to information freedom, and as well as the promise of information freedom. But I talked about a number of threats. And in some ways, what I talked about last night was the easy half of my kind of two-part sequence of talks. There were no, when I talked about political censorship, there weren't a bunch of people who stood up and protested, but no, political censorship is a good thing, you know, there are not two sides to that issue, basically. So today's the harder talk. And this is a subject that's very unresolved in my mind. It's very unresolved in the minds of every society in the world, and it's unresolved in the American democracy in particular. And that is the tension between privacy and knowledge. So that's really the point that I'm going to explore today. And then, of course, my clicker no longer works. Well, I don't know what we'll do about that. I'll have to do it this way. My book was mentioned here. This talk is not really based in the book, but since it was, some of it is there. For those of you who are interested in the books, there's two ways to get the book. You can get it, you can pay for it, or you can get it for free. You can do whichever you want. If you want it free, Carmen said that I was an advocate of information sharing, and it's true. You can just go to the book website and just download it. So I just wanted everybody to know that. And also, I'm going to leave behind my slides if anybody wants to have those as well. So here's the kind of outline of my talk. And there's a certain amount of this where I'm going to talk in metaphors and parables, and I'll explain what they are. So first I'm going to talk about Hillary and the snake, and then I'm going to talk about my house, and I'm going to talk about bees and fertilizer, and then I'm going to talk about planetary memory, whatever that is, and I'm going to talk about global warming at the end, okay? So everybody here, you're actually looking for the other talk. I can see everybody thinks that they wound up in the wrong room. These are all metaphors. So the talk is about privacy and knowledge. And just as by way of prologue, I want to talk about the fact that we actually have, culturally, from our most ancient roots, we actually have some misgivings and fear about knowledge as much as we all believe that knowledge is the way to a better world. So this is there's a fairly deep-seated tension here. This part about my house is about the big issue of how much information should really be public. And at what point public information becomes too intrusive. The bees and fertilizer has to do with information control, and not so much by governments or by corporations, but kind of I'm trying to see into the future to the point where everybody has so much information that there will be impulses, very reasonable impulses, to think that it ought to be controlled. And then I want to talk about to what extent are we willing to sacrifice our personal privacy in order to increase knowledge. And finally, when I talk about global warming, I'm not really going to talk about global warming. I'm going to talk about environmental science as an example of a science that is explicitly normative. It actually has a mission about how the world should be. And I want to argue that sort of computer and communication sciences ought to be evolving into that kind of science. Okay, so here we go. Hillary and the snake. So this story begins a little more than a year ago when when Google decided to essentially pull out of the Chinese mainland in a dispute that was partly over the fact that the Chinese hackers were knocking down its servers and were invading its email programs, but to a large extent was over this very sort of libertarian ideal that I'm talking about, that Google stood for freedom of knowledge, and if they couldn't, and they refused to do business in a place where their censorship was as severe as it was. That's actually a very simplified and, on Google's part, self-serving of the story. They were also losing market share, but you know that's okay. I'll give them some. I do want to give them some credit, but let's, for the purpose of the parable, we'll take the idealistic version of events here. And Hillary Clinton gave this speech where she touted some good, solid American values. The more freely information flows, the stronger societies become. This was her speech on internet freedom, not the one she gave a year later, but the one she gave back in the winter of, not the past winter, but before. Access to information helps citizens hold their governments accountable, generates new ideas, encourages creativity and entrepreneurship. So she gave a very level-headed, confident manifesto for information freedom in defense of Google. She then went on, however, to put in some qualifications. She said, well, we must also recognize that these technologies are not an unmitigated blessing. Free expression has its limits. And you know, usually, in this country at least, when American politicians say free expression has its limits, they mean child pornography, for example. That's the classical case where everybody agrees that's over the edge and doesn't deserve First Amendment protections and so on. But that isn't what she was talking about. She says, those who use the internet to recruit terrorists or distribute stolen intellectual property cannot divorce their online actions from their real-world identities. And I actually was a little troubled by this statement because, you know, we know who, you know, the terrorists are, you know, so we don't believe, you know, that people like Osama bin Laden have the same freedom as the rest of us do, but the people who distribute, you know, stolen intellectual property, that's like, you know, lots of teenagers I know. This, you know, it's a kind of a rhetorical, it's a nice grand rhetorical phrase, but it really does seem to lump, you know, Osama bin Laden in with my daughter, and in a way that I couldn't quite accept. So part of my point here is you just got to read all of these things critically, because simple statements often have much grander consequences than they seem to on the surface when the question is about intellectual property and information freedom. There was another aspect of this speech which I thought was curious and interesting. You can go to the State Department website, just Google Hillary's, Clinton internet freedom. You pull up the State Department site and the Secretary of State lecturing the world and China in particular on internet freedom and free expression and all the rest of that stuff. And then there's this little logo down in the corner here. So what's that? Well, when you click on that, you discover that the State Department doesn't run its own video servers. The video servers that serve Hillary Clinton's internet freedom speech to the world are actually done by a private company called Brightcove. Brightcove has a privacy policy, like everybody else has a privacy policy. When you read the privacy policy, what it says is, we treat IP addresses non-personal information. Those are the identifying numbers that are associated with the connection of your computer to the internet and locates your computer in the internet. And we reserve the right to share non-personal information with affiliates and other third parties. In other words, if the Chinese government called up Brightcove and said, could you give us the IP addresses of all of the computers that have watched the Hillary Clinton internet freedom videos, Brightcove might say, well, how much do you want to pay us? We'll send that information to you. So nothing is ever simple. Even the Secretary of State of the US government giving a speech about internet freedom has got this potential, back there under the Brightcove menu in the privacy policy, there's a potential for commercial exploitation. So, okay. Our misgivings about knowledge and privacy, and let's not say privacy right now, but our misgivings about knowledge itself and whether universal access to all the world's information and knowledge, are as deep as the human species. So here's Prometheus, and we all know the Prometheus myth. Prometheus went up to Olympus and brought back fire, which was a symbol for knowledge and technology and human learning in general. Brought it back to Earth, and we always celebrate Prometheus as he was considered really to be the first man in Greek mythology. And here he is on Rockefeller Plaza in New York City. He's the symbol of everything progressive about human knowledge and technology. But what happened to Prometheus? Remember what happened to Prometheus? Zeus chained him to a rock and had an eagle eat at his liver. So it was a really severe price to pay. And it wasn't just that, it was worse. What else happened to humankind because of Prometheus? This woman, who's this? Pandora. Did you guys? We all know the Pandora myth, but do you remember Pandora was actually Prometheus's sister-in-law, right? Zeus sent her down and tempted Prometheus's brother with her, and Prometheus tried to warn him off, but of course he didn't pay any attention to her, and he married, and she opened the box that brought with it all of the sins and evils that have beset human civilization ever since. So there in the Greek mythology is the tension, this sort of tension between the wonders and the fear of knowledge is with us today. I just grabbed a couple of photographs from about 2 weeks ago. Here we are in Egypt. The Egyptian revolution was the Facebook revolution. Even the Egyptian revolutionaries apparently recognized it. And therefore, who is the enemy? This is, we love Muhammad, say no to Facebook. Right? The vehicles by which information is spreading become the enemy. And it's true in Christian traditions as well. I'm sorry it's always the woman, but this is the way it's the way all of our sacred texts in every religion seem to have evolved. What was it that the serpent said to Eve? The serpent said to Eve is, hey, try this. When you eat of it, your eyes will be open and you will be like God. So anyway, our sort of misgivings about what will happen to us if we have too much knowledge are very deep-seated. So this tension between knowledge and privacy in particular now, that I want to talk about, there's actually interpretation of our founding principles of the American democracy implicit in it in the First and Fourth Amendment. First Amendment, Congress will make no law abridging the freedom of speech. We're allowed to say, we're all allowed to listen to whatever it is. And the Fourth Amendment says, the right of people to be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects against unreasonable searches and seizures should not be violated. And this is kind of a dilemma between, our right to spread information and our right to keep information about ourselves to ourselves. And one of the complexities of this dilemma as it plays out in the United States, which is different from the way it plays out in other democracies, in European democracies in particular, is that this is as close to a privacy right as is really enshrined in the Constitution. This isn't really a privacy right. All this says is that you have a right to privacy, a limited right to privacy in terms of keeping information away from the government, but not from anybody else. So the sort of American tradition is that the right of expression is paramount and takes precedence over our rights to keep information to ourselves. And that's always been a source of tension in society, in the law, but it's really blowing up now because so much more information is available. And I'm going to take you through some of the examples of that. So before I launch into my three-part lecture here, I want to lay out for public view my biases. They're widely shared biases. They're all principles that we've all learned from a young age. More information is always better than less information. The answer to bad information, misinformation, is not to try to shut it down, but to supply better information so that through a process of education, people will learn the truth, and rather than trying to suppress the falsehood. Truth emerges from reasoned debate, grounded in verifiable facts. Right? This is the way truth arrives, not through some kind of authoritarian or totalitarian edict. The answer to anonymous or offensive speech is, not to suppress it, not to outlaw it, it's to ignore it. Sticks and stones may hurt my bones, but words will never hurt me. And finally, education is our only hope of surviving this information flood with some kind of sense of honor and our other, basic human values intact. So these are things I believe, but every one of these has a question, and you'll see I'm going to pop up with questions throughout this lecture that I think we're all going to have to think about going forward. Okay, so here's my house. Let's imagine ourselves sitting down in an internet cafe in some nice part of Pakistan, and getting a glass of bottled water, getting our Marlboros, going in there and sitting down at the internet cafe and getting on the internet like all of us do every day, and say Google like Harry Lewis. And you immediately come up with the fact that my phone number is 617-277-0371. I live at 6 Hawes Street, and that the local time there is 10:28 p.m. at the moment. And there's a nice little map there, so you can see exactly where my house is with a nice little sharp point on the pin back. Here we are in Islamabad. Isn't that interesting? Okay? Then, of course, you go to Google Maps and Google Street View, And you can see, he keeps his lawn nicely mowed. Isn't that nice? And this is the street that he lives on. Okay. All right. How interesting. This is what his house was worth before the crash happened. This is how much all of the neighbors' houses cost. This is how many bad bedrooms he has. This is how many bathrooms he has. Okay, this is just the standard real estate website. Okay, you can then check the Federal Election Commission voter contribution, political campaign contribution database, which has got this nice mashup. This is called Fundrace. I didn't put it up here. This is the Fundrace website where the FEC data, which is publicly accessible data, is mashed up with the Google Maps. My house is actually right here. I apparently didn't make any contributions, neither did my wife, but my good friend Michael Robbins, with whom I had dinner on last Thursday, he apparently gave, $1,000 to the Massachusetts Republican Party. No surprise there. My other neighbor next to him, Jerry Cohen, whose house, by the way, is for sale, which you can also see if you want to buy it. He gave to the other party and all the rest of that. And isn't that, here we are sitting in Islamabad, taking this little tour of my neighborhood and my house. But I haven't told you anything you didn't know, right? I mean, you knew that this data was public. But the politically, it's been public since sometime in the 70s at least, maybe in the 60s. But what did public used to mean? Public used to mean that you would have to physically take yourself to Washington, D.C. somewhere, write Harry Lewis on a find some sleepy clerk with a file cabinet, hand it to them, and the clerk would come back, an hour later and give you the datum, the one datum. And then if you wanted another datum, you had to go back and, make another trip. Now you can sit in Islamabad and just mouse over my neighborhood and have these little windows pop up with the names of all of my neighbors and how much money they contributed and to whom. So public just, in my book, I have a number of principles that I lay out, and one of the principles is sometimes more of the same thing is a whole new thing. And this is public. It always was public, or it's been public for decades. But somehow, public meaning you've got to physically go to Washington, D.C. with one name on a piece of paper, and public meaning you can sit in an internet cafe in Islamabad and mouse over my neighborhood are two different things, right? So this is a very challenged issue. So this is question number one of my list of challenges to the libertarian principles is, should public information be less public? Here's a very interesting court case that was decided last year. And it had to do with ballot initiatives. So in the state of Washington, there was some kind of pro-gay civil union statute passed, and the anti-gay union folks got together and did what you do. They wanted the plebiscite to overturn that law. And they do what you do to get, to petition your government to have that changed. You go around and collect a bunch of signatures on street corners so that it would go on the ballot, and in the next election, the voters would decide whether to let that law stand or have it rescinded. And what happened was that the people who were defenders of this gay civil union statute asked for the names of the people who'd signed the petitions so that they could be posted on the World Wide Web for everybody to see. And now, the names of people who signed petitions are another thing that have always been public, in the sense that if you sign a petition, there's some kind of controversy, and people petition the government to have this law repealed, the other side gets to go in and examine the list of names and make sure that it's not full of Donald Ducks and Mickey Mouses, right? The signatures can be challenged by the opponents of whoever is putting this petition forward. But they wanted to go a little bit further. This would be, so we can get our side straight here. So this is sort of the pro-civil union folks wanted to take the names of the petitioners against civil unions and put them on the web so that people in cafes in Islamabad could see them. Well, so that they would say, but people in Washington State could see them, but once they're up on the web, they're up on the web. So this turned into a Supreme Court case where there was a real issue about how transparent should this be. The people who were asking for this information to be made public had, in some unguarded moments in their email correspondence, it turned out, said that they wanted to make the anti-civil union people uncomfortable. They wanted them to have uncomfortable conversations. And the people who were felt, the people who had signed the petition said, we're going to be subject to threats, harassment, and reprisals for the simple act of doing, what people in democracies are privileged to do, which is petitioning their government for repeal of laws. And, ordinary people are now being advised that their privacy is to be set aside in the same way that politicians' privacy was set aside years ago. I mean, we all worry that good people don't want to go into politics because they don't want their children's schools to be picketed or something like that. They don't want the level of exposure that it requires. So is this principle now going to extend all the way to people who just sign referenda? And there's a very strong argument on the other side that says, yes, you actually sort of, when you ask for repeal of a law, you're becoming part of the governmental process. And this is this wonderful quote from John Adams: people have a right, an indisputable, unalienable, indefeasible, divine right. I mean, you could see how, just hear him pounding his fist on the table on this. To that most dreaded and envied kind of knowledge, I mean the character and conduct of their rulers. And in a democracy, everybody, certainly anybody who is participating this way, is in some way involved in the governance process. If it doesn't write, more information is always the answer, right? More information is all. It's our libertarian principle. More information is always better than less information. Well, this case was ultimately settled in the Supreme Court by a vote of 8-1 in favor of openness. Okay, so all but one justice voted to support so it was a very interesting vote because it didn't split on liberal conservative lines. All of the liberals were inside of openness, and all the conservatives except for Justice Thomas were in favor of openness. And Justice Scalia wrote one of the majority opinions, joined by the people from the other side of the Supreme Court aisle, and he said, he doesn't want to look forward to living in a democracy where people have so little civic courage that they're unwilling to sign a petition to repeal a law. But you can understand the other side of the argument. But this is an example of the First Amendment, the openness principle dominating, the privacy principle. I don't know how this is going to play out in the long run. We're all going to have to figure out how to do with it. This is a New York Times story from the time of the 2008 presidential election, after when Obama was starting to appoint his cabinet and other senior government officials, anybody who wanted to work for him had to fill out a questionnaire of the kind that, of course, we all are used to filling out when we take sensitive jobs. But this one went a little beyond what had been done before. Electronic communications. If you have ever sent an electronic communication, including but not limited to an email, text message, or instant message, that could suggest a conflict of interest or be a possible source of embarrassment to you or the president-elect if it were made public, please describe, period. Okay? Now, is there anyone in this room who has ever sent an email that could be potentially embarrassing if it were ever made public? Is there anybody who can seriously say that they haven't, right? I mean, you know, get an email account, and it will happen very quickly if you haven't. So this, now, of course, it doesn't say you're not going to be appointed if you have ever done that. But it says you've got to explain to your future employer what you wrote that could be potentially embarrassing if it ever came public. So this is another question. You know, writings begins off completely in a sort of standard way. Please list and, if readily available, provide a copy of each book, article, column, or publication, including but not limited to posts or comments on blogs or other websites. Wait a minute, that part didn't used to be in there. Publication was a publication. It was something that was public, right? And, well, like blogs are public, I guess, but, and you have authored individually or with others, and then please list all aliases or handles you have used to communicate on the internet. Oops. So, you know, at some level, you know, you look at this and you say, okay, we know where this is going. This is going to produce a nation of liars, right? I mean, the people, they had a reason for adopting a pseudonym, you know, calling themselves whatever they decided to call themselves, Joe DiMaggio 472 or something like this. And so the notion that to seek a high, you know, appointment in the Obama administration, you're really expecting, I mean, is he serious? I don't know. I don't know. So there's a dilemma. I'm going to flip through this quickly, but I just want to say, at some point, I think almost everybody will agree that too much transparency about what is in fact public information goes over the edge. And this is the site that lists the names of doctors who perform abortions using strike-through font if they've been killed. Okay, so this was the subject of a Supreme Court case. So this is actually hard to look at. So I'm going to not put it up there very often. But it was a close call in the courts whether this was threatening or not. There's no explicit threat through there. It just draws a name through the lines. Wake up one morning and the font has been changed. Okay, bees and fertilizer. So this is now about the control of dangerous knowledge, and this word dangerous really ought to be included in quotation marks. We used to think that those of us, and I see there's maybe one or two of us who I can count as members of my own generation, we used to think that the threat to privacy was the government, and that you know, all of us who grew up reading George Orwell, 1984 in school, understood that the government was the threat. And the government still is the threat. And I have a lot of respect for people who work in law enforcement. They've got a hard job. It's harder in a democracy than it is in a non-democracy, but a democracy is what we've got to deal with here. And so when the FBI proposed, as it proposed a year or so ago, that it would be really cool and really helpful to them if internet service providers all kept long lists of the URLs of every website every one of their subscribers had ever visited, so that if any of us was ever suspected of having committed a crime, they could subpoena them and check what websites we had gone to. There was a fairly strong backlash in the civil liberties community, and I'm glad of it, as useful as I am sure that would be for investigatory purposes. In fact, you know, there are lots of crimes that get solved by looking at what websites people have gone to. Usually they seize your computer and then look at the history on the, you know, in your browser. But just to make sure that the criminals who were smart enough not to keep their histories alive, they wanted the FBI asked Congress to require ISPs to keep that information centrally at, Comcast, whoever your cable company is that's providing your internet service. So the government still is part of the surveillance worry, but today's, we're really beyond that now. Now the people who really have access to the information are the private companies that accumulate lots of information, including those internet service providers that I just mentioned. And that is an example, the story I just told is an example of the sort of convergence where there can be partnerships between public interests and private interests. And that's an old story too. This wiretap law is in the same event. But Amazon knows everything about what we're interested in reading. Google, we're going to talk a lot about Google, has lots of information about us, and so does eBay and all of these other companies. But it's not just the information companies, and it's pretty much everybody we do business with in one way or another is gathering information about us, which is very valuable for commercial purposes. But we're clearly in some kind of stage of evolution where we're trying to figure out as a society how much of this makes sense. So here's a little story that is a true story that happened to me. I went to get my car fixed. And I have a Toyota Prius. I love it. It needed a software upgrade, of course. That one itself was a digital story, right? Its brakes needed a software upgrade. Has anybody had this actually done? So at Herb Chambers in Boston, where I have it done, you call like you're calling for an oil change or something, and they make an appointment, and you bring the car in, and they tell you to wait out in the lounge, and then they plug something into it, and they dump a bunch of new bits into it, and then they wash the car before they give it back to you, as though they'd actually made it dirty somehow. All they did was they just plugged an Ethernet cable into the middle of the car somewhere, and then sent you on their way. Anyway, so I was sitting there in the lounge, and I was getting a lecture ready, and I Googled library science because I was using the term, and I wasn't quite sure how far it extended. And I clicked on the first link, which was to Wikipedia, of course. And this is what happened. I got this message, this sort of ominous message. This site is blocked by Herb Chambers Companies, security services. This event has been logged. Herb Chambers Toyota has logged the fact that I was trying to get to the Wikipedia page on library science. Okay, so their filter has some issues here, but how much else are they logging? Is Herb Chambers Toyota? Well, I guess they could. I mean, there was probably some I agree box that I clicked when I established that wireless connection that said I wouldn't do certain things, and they had certain rights. And who the hell knows? I didn't read the terms of service for the thing. But there are endless opportunities to gather and save information about all of us, not just the things that are going through, through Google and so on. So the wireless companies have provided information to the government without their customers realizing it, GPS location information. And this was an interesting story. And when it went to court, the federal government defended itself by saying that location information of a telephone doesn't require a wiretap order because it's not content. It's just like the numbers you dial, so-called pen register data, are not subject to, don't require wiretap orders either. And anyway, the federal government defended itself in saying, says, anybody who does not wish to disclose his movements to the government need not use a cellular telephone. There's a simple remedy. If you don't want Uncle Sam to know where you are all the time, don't use a cellular telephone. Duh. Okay. Well, you know, we laugh, but this case was a huge important case. You know, the most important case you've never heard of went to trial last February, and the answer is the Federal Appeals Court said yes, your cellular provider can turn over to the government your location data, which of course you know is updated constantly. Whether you have a GPS phone or just even an old-fashioned phone, if anybody has them anymore, can turn that over to federal investigators without asking you or telling you. So that's the law of the land. If you don't like it, don't carry a telephone. This information this location information has lots of commercial value, and this is the you know, there was some columns last week about Eisenhower's great speech about the military-industrial complex. And we've got here a little bit of the same kind of phenomenon. We've got a commercial and law enforcement complex at place where the information is valuable to both parties, and so they support each other in collecting it. But you know, this is just something. I have a place in Montana, northwest Montana. It's beautiful in the Rocky Mountains and so on. You think you're getting away from it all. And I one time while I was out there, this stupid ad popped up on the screen, is the way ads annoyingly always do. It says, Kalispell mom. Kalispell is the airport. It's the town nearest my place. Kalispell mom loses 47 pounds following one rule. Well, you know, obviously, I cut down 47 pounds of stomach fat in a month by obeying this one rule. Well, they didn't know that I'm not a woman. They didn't know that I'm not fat. Well, all right, never mind that. But they did know exactly where I was, and I didn't think anything about it, except that the next morning I got on the airplane and came back to Boston and visited the same webpage, and I got the same ad with the same mom, the same 47 pounds, but now she's in Brighton, Massachusetts. So, you know, the information is enormously valuable for commercial purposes. This is funny only because it's so lame, right? I mean, this is like early stage use of this geographic information. In this case, not cellular information, but just the information that the internet service provider produces. And, you know, the problem is, you know, we got to be aware of this stuff while it's happening now, because in a few years it will get so subtle and careful that we won't know. So now let's think about the other side of the coin. Okay? So I said these were dilemmas. So the other side of the coin is this woman's story, Tanya Ryder. Tanya Ryder is a woman in Seattle, Washington, and she was driving to the office one day, and her car went off the side of the highway, tumbled down the embankment, and it was a horrible crash, and she was trapped in that car for a week before she was found. She was barely alive when she was found. She was in kidney failure and so on. She's reasonably recovered now. And she was found because she had her cell phone on her. She couldn't make a call, but before the cell phone died, the little here I am, here I am, here I am messages that cell phones always send out so that the nearby cell phone tower, you know, so that the cellular carrier will know which cell phone tower to direct incoming calls to. You know, that data was kept, and the police used that data to go search the area. So the question is, why did it take them a week? Why did it take them a week? And the answer is because Washington State, being a progressive state on privacy, had enacted very strict privacy legislation about that cell phone tracking data. And so when her husband called the police office and said, "My wife has gone missing, please find her," they laughed at him and they said, "Yeah, everybody's wife goes missing, and the husbands always want us to find them." And you know, the good people of Washington got onto that trick, and they made it impossible for us to get access to that information or anybody else to get access to that information because the privacy standards in our state are so very high. And it wasn't until he was actually placed under suspicion as a suspect in her disappearance that the police were able to get access to the data and then go find her, which they found her almost immediately once that happened. All right, so Tanya Ryder is probably very glad that her cell phone company was watching where she is all the time. So, okay, so their law was a little buggy in the same way that the Kalispell Brighton moms, advising stuff is a little buggy, but how the bugs get kinked out of all of these laws are going to be very important to the future. But it's not just getting them right, because we don't know what right is. So this guy, this was last week or 2 weeks ago or something, this guy got out of a speeding ticket because he's lame enough to have on his cell phone a piece of software that tracks not only his location, but his location every half second or something like that. And it calculates, and he was able to demonstrate to the satisfaction of the judge that he was at this point at 4:07:33 p.m. and the other place at 4:07:56 p.m. and he was therefore going only 26 miles an hour, not 45 miles an hour as the police officer claimed. Okay, so a nice story, but the question behind the story is, would we be better off if everything was recorded all the time? If we weren't doing anything wrong, we'd have nothing to worry about. And if we were ever accused of doing something wrong when we hadn't, if that information was always there, we'd be able to prove our innocence. I'll come back to that. By the way, everybody should know that cell phones can be bugged. You can actually just go to some website and figure out how to do that. You want to know where your kids are all the time, or your wife, or your husband. If you ever get in a taxi cab with somebody and they take the battery out of their cell phone, that shows that they're actually afraid that their cell phone might be on even though it looks like it's off. So anyway, that's it. Okay, so that's geolocation information. Here's information about our biometrics, what we look like, and our fingerprints and all the rest of it. But I want to talk about fingerprints. That's so old hat. So this is a really troubling story, and I don't know what to do about it. This was a research done by Jeremy Bailenson, who's a professor at Stanford. And at the time of the Bush-Kerry election, so this was back in 2004, he got a bunch of subjects in, college students, and asked them who they were going to vote for and showed them the pictures of the two choices, George Bush and John Kerry. And they voted, a few weeks before the election, pretty much the way the election came out. A little more for Bush than for Kerry, and at this point there were a certain number undecided. Fine. But this was actually the control group. This was not the group he was experimenting on. The group he was experimenting on were split into two parts. Half the group were shown the picture of the real John Kerry, and not the real George Bush, but the real George Bush with a little bit of the subject's own face mixed into the image, morphed into the image. So there was a camera on the subject, and unbeknownst to the subject, the real John Kerry, the choices were the real John Kerry and George Bush, just with a little bit of the subject mixed in, undetectable. And George Bush wins by a landslide in that experiment. And then they pleaded the other experiment, showed them the real George Bush and John Kerry with a little bit of the subject, a Filipino woman, it doesn't matter, whatever it was, just a little bit of the subject herself mixed in, and all of a sudden, Kerry wins. Okay? Not one subject ever noticed that that they weren't seeing the real George Bush and the real John Kerry. These, in fact, are not the real George Bush and the real John Kerry. This is George Bush with this guy mixed in. This is John Kerry with that woman mixed in. Okay, you understand what's being done? So this is absolutely terrifying. I mean, unless you're in the advertising business and you say, wow, this is a great opportunity, okay? Because, you know, faces are easy to find. Mine isn't. You can't go to my Facebook page and find it, but everybody else in creation has their face up on their Facebook page and lots of other places, and I guess they could get my face from a poster here, but you can get them from Facebook. There are 100 million ways to figure out the face of somebody who's connected to the internet, and you know, so what do we do about that? Do we like try to regulate the advertising business, regulate the use of this, and so on? These are so the effect is so subtle you wouldn't know whether it was missing, but you know, the association of our names and our electronic identities with our faces is so easily done now. And there's all kinds of stuff that Google knows about us, okay? And this is such a tired subject that I hesitate to even mention it, except that I'm naughty, so I'm going to do this. So, you know, try this sometime in the privacy of your household. You know, just type, how do I get my wife, or how do I get my husband? And then you get these little drop-down menus of choices. So these are, I hope, not personalized about me when I tried them, but I think these are some kind of aggregated and so on. But it's an incredible commentary on American society somehow. So here we go. Everybody ready? How do I get my wife? How do I get my wife to swing? And my husband, how do I get my husband to fall in love with me? Isn't that sad? What a pathetic. How do I get my wife in the mood? How do I get my husband back? How do I get my wife to shave? How do I get my husband to help around the house? At least we're getting a little practical here. How do I get my wife to want me? How do I get my husband to notice me? How do I get my wife to lose weight? How do I get my husband to move out? Okay. How do I get my wife to sleep with me? How do I get my husband to talk to me? How do I get my wife to fall in love with me again? How do I get my husband to appreciate me? How do I get my wife to love me again? How do I get my husband to love me again? How do I get my wife pregnant? How do I get my husband to stop drinking? Okay, so if that isn't a commentary on American society. Okay, so you know, it's hilarious. These are apparently these are aggregated among real internet searches of people who are such losers that they have to ask Google, you know, how to get along with their spouse. Okay, so it's not a random sample of the American population by any means, but your web searches are saved, right? Your web searches are saved. It's just a reminder of how much information Google has, and we think of it as just a utility, and it is kind of a utility, but they're very clear about what they want. They want to organize the world's information, make it universally accessible and useful, and and how are they going to achieve that? Well, Sergey Brin says the perfect search engine would understand exactly what you mean and give back exactly what you want, right? Not what the average American wants, what you want. And is that what we want? And the answer is, a lot of the time we do. So anyway, the Google search history, I won't do that. This is just another wonderful example. I did it quickly last night, but if you've never seen it, it's a marvel. Google knows so much about us that it's actually able to predict breakouts of the flu better than the Center for Disease Control can, because the leading indicator on flu outbreaks turns out to be people sitting down and typing in headache, sniffles, sore throat, influenza remedy, whatever it is. And so Google's just sort of aggregated that, but they're great people. They're all public spirited. They're really, I love them all, and they give this information to the Center for Disease Control, but they're a private company. They don't have to do any of this, right? They say their motto is good, be evil, but they could say that and still be evil, and we'd never know the difference. And anyway, this is an incredibly accurate predictor. This is an actual, over the course of 5 years, of influenza outbreaks in America and Google's predictions. One is yellow and one is blue. So the level of detail they have because of the massive amounts of information they have. Okay, so this is, let me close up here about suggestions and surrender. This business of suggestions, in a way, it's there's some fear that it's sapping us of personal agency. Yes, it's great when Amazon recommends books to us that are like the books we want to see, but we're turning over of certain kinds of control, and so it's like these suggestion mechanisms, recommendation engines, and so on. They're like advertising. They're something that we actually need to learn to resist, and that young people need to learn to resist. Except that the difference is that the Federal Trade Commission actually regulates advertising, and it doesn't regulate large other parts of the internet space. So we used to think government was the big brother. The big brother was the thing to be feared, and it still is. This is another example of a school which had the bright idea of turning on the cameras and the laptops that it lent out to students to see whether they were doing drugs at home. But now we've got this sort of more benign, helpful Google acting as the kind of helicopter parent to us all, as an equally serious threat. Here's our Amazon recommendation system. They recommend my own book to me, so the system isn't perfect, I guess, but Future of the Internet. These are all good books. Here Comes Everybody. These are exactly the sort of books that I like to read. Books about my student Mark Zuckerberg. Yes, they want to show that to me too. Oops, there we go. So that's the corporate threat. So we have the government threat, the corporate threat. This is a long wind-up to my pitch here. The third threat is we ourselves. I'm going to do this one very quickly. We have met the enemy and he is us. And by that I just mean that we sacrifice so much of our privacy on these supermarket, loyalty card things, right? You have them down here, right? Yeah, everybody has them, right? You really feel good about getting 25 cents off on a bag of potato chips, in exchange for which your supermarket knows, how much Maalox you buy and how much beer and which brand you buy, and so they're just buying, this information from you. And the phrase in the business is that the regular price is not, the real price is the discounted price, and the high price is the price with the privacy tax attached to it. Right? This is the extra tax that they tack on if you're unwilling to tell them how many cartons of cigarettes you consume per month. Okay? With no guarantees. Has anybody ever read the fine print? That they won't turn that information over to your health insurer if the health insurer goes and asks them to sell it to them. So that's, so here we go. So here we rationally in some ways, but unreasonably in other ways, give up lots of privacy, and the government response to it, the way the government is helpful to us, is they say they have to tell us what they're doing when they do it. And that sounds reasonable and fair enough. But how many of us have ever read one of those I agree checkboxes, So, while I was getting these slides together, I just decided I'd try a new one. I usually do Google's, but I'll do Yahoo's. You get a Yahoo account. You have to fill in your name and, birth date, whatever it is. And, and then you do this create, this is not even an I agree box. This is a create my account box. So you read the fine print above the create my account box, and it says, by clicking on the create my account button below, I certify that I have read, here we are, turning the entire world into liars once again. I certify that I have read and agreed to the Yahoo exclamation point terms of service, the Yahoo exclamation point privacy policy. If I were at Stanford, I'd want to be, and there is one, a Yahoo exclamation point professor of computer science. I think that would be the coolest title to have, the Yahoo exclamation point professor of computer science. Anyway, there we are. The Yahoo exclamation point privacy policy and communication terms of service, and to receive da-di-da-di-da. Well, I actually decided I would click on these and see what they were. And the terms of service are 5,585 words. The privacy policy is a mere 1,446 words. And the communications terms of service is another 7,496. It's a small book. It's like a novella or something like that. I don't know, maybe not a full-length feature film-length book, but it's, so nobody does. This is a complete joke. It's a complete scam, right? These are legal, and it gets worse because when you actually read the terms of service, what do they say? They say, Yahoo may provide you with changes to the terms of service indicated but not limited to postings on Yahoo services. Your agreement to this terms of service constitutes your agreement that you are deemed to have received any and all of the notices that should have been delivered had you accessed the terms of service. So they can change what's under that button anytime they want and without telling you, and you're supposed to go back there every 5 minutes to check to see if the terms that the 10,000 words that you read through and agreed to, whether they've changed them, because they retain the right to change them anytime they want. I mean, this is, God bless lawyers. When we need them, we love them, but this is insane. Okay, but that's not what I came here to talk to you about. What I came to talk to you about is a new threat. And the new threat is the hive. And what I mean by the hive is the collection of ordinary individuals who collectively are creating something. So the great example, the noble example, the wonderful example of the hive is Wikipedia. This is a hive product. This was not done by people who had education in encyclopedia writing. It was done by lots of ordinary people making lots of small contributions. It's a marvel, okay? It's right most of the time. It's righter more of the time than encyclopedias are, actually. So it's a great thing. But the same process of kind of peer production, collectively putting something together, can be done now by anybody to produce lots of other things. So, for example, if you go on the web, you can, for a few $100s, buy a Bolide Technology Group BC2002.HQ.DNLV car license plate reading box camera or many others of the same variety, which will capture license plates at up to 90 miles per hour. So what we should all do is set up on the lampposts and trees outside our houses or on the walls outside our houses license plate readers that will capture the license plates of cars going by. And then we can start to assemble a database, perfect in Puerto Rico because it's an island. There aren't that many cars and they probably all circulate around. And we can timestamp them, right? Everybody has a little bit of software, and we just start clicking. Okay, this car, Mike, let's say I had brought my car down to the island here. This is my HRL, very distinctive license plate. I'm not. This one you can probably even guess who it belongs to. He was here at 4:57 p.m. and he was there at 9:32 a.m. and so on and so forth. And if you have enough people cooperating on this, you start to get a nice map of all of the movements of all of the vehicles in Puerto Rico. Now, Who owns which car is not public information in most states, as I understand. I don't know what it is here. It's probably not public information. But there are all kinds of ways to get that connected. If you set up one of these license plate readers at a parking lot, for example, and noticed a car go in and out, and you line that up with the times people made purchases, for example, if you were a merchant inside the mall or something like that, you might be able to infer that this person was probably the owner of that car. So we've now got, we're kind of trying to think futuristically. We can imagine now a nice, thing done by teenagers as their community service project or something like that in high school, of a massive database of the locations and timestamps of all of the vehicles in Puerto Rico. Now, I don't like this idea, but I have a very hard time saying why people shouldn't be allowed to do it. Because every little bit of this information is public information. Nobody, if I see your car or a car with a particular license plate driving down the street and I write that information down, I'm not violating anybody's privacy. And so what is it about aggregating lots of information that suddenly turns the individual data collection into a privacy violation? And the answer is just that it's so much of it, but then how much is too much? And even if it's too much, do we really want to say that if you get too much private information that it should be improper to hold it? So a nice form of this question, and this is a really troubling question, okay, is, would we rather have everybody know everything about us, or let's say about the movements of our car? Would we rather be in a world where that was the case? Or there's another world, which in the case of the license technology is simple as apple pie. You take the license plates off the cars and you put some kind of RFID chips on them or something like that, so that they can be scanned by the police, who have special readers and can, but the rest, ordinary citizens wouldn't be able to do it. So the question is that preferable? Would we rather have everybody know everything about us, or have only the police know everything about us? Right? That's an alternative. This technological alternative exists. Yeah, I see somebody shaking and somebody nodding, so I don't know whether they're agreeing or disagreeing. It's a hard question. Face data is another biometric that's easily collected. I talked about it before. I'm going to keep track of. Oh, I'm doing fine on time. Okay. Faces. Faces are all over the web. And that's been the case for a long time, ever since Picasa and these other photo sharing albums started popping up. And people upload their family photos so their grandparents in the other end of the world can see them and so on. But what's happening now is that people are adding more and more tags. They're identifying, attaching name data. Most photos taken by digital cameras now already have location attached to them. And Facebook says every day people add more than 100 million tags to photos on the Facebook, type one name and apply it to multiple photos of the same person. Tag suggestions make tagging multiple photos even more convenient and so on. So it's very easy now to associate tags with faces. And face recognition is also getting very good. Any digital camera now has some form of face recognition. They will actually query a little index of faces that it knows, and if it can identify the face, it'll tag it for you automatically, which is great. It's a nuisance to tag photos, and it's wonderful to be able to sit on your laptop and look for all the photos of, your sister-in-law or whatever it is. So this is all good stuff. But as this starts to now be everything, everywhere, you get these creepy possibilities. So, for example, I had lunch in Old San Juan yesterday with two very nice ladies. Suppose there was somebody at the next table who took a picture, you know, not of me, but a picture of their little party at their table, and I was in the background with these two nice ladies. Okay, and then they upload that photo to Facebook. Okay, and then my wife does, it's not, we don't have it quite yet, but it's coming. You know, the super smart, you know, go over the whole web and find pictures of Harry button, click. And there's Harry in the background of this picture of this very nice fish restaurant in Old San Juan with these two lovely ladies. Now, my wife is an understanding woman. She trusts me and all the rest of that. I'm sure I have nothing to worry about. We have a very transparent relationship and so on. But you see where this is going. You see this is, and my trouble with this one is I don't know how to stop it. I don't know how to stop it. I don't know where you would put the filter. I don't know how you would say where to stop it, and you know, without pressing back on some very fundamental civil rights. I mean, that guy at the next table had the right to take a picture of his family at the nice fish restaurant in Old San Juan, and he should have the right to post it to the internet. But the anonymity is so much harder now than it used to be. And even if you don't have your photo tagged anywhere, there are people who will tag it for you. So, this was after a riot at the University of California. The UC Police Department put a bunch of photos of students or people who were rioting up on the web and offered a $50 reward of anybody who would go tag the photos and identify who the malefactors were. Okay? Exactly the same thing as the Iranian government did during the Green Revolution. They put up some photos, who's this guy, who's this guy, and reward people who would identify them. It's not just faces. That, everything. There are all of these biometrics that are identifiable. Your gait is very identifying. Okay, maybe not perfectly identifying. I'm not completely familiar with the state of the technology. And being able to attach me to my gait might potentially be of some forensic value. We had a crime committed in Boston. So I'm just going to point up here because the little clearer picture. It's a very dark surveillance video, and the only thing that you could see was the person walking away. You couldn't identify anything else. But it was the person had a little bit of a limp of a certain kind. It should have been easily identifying. Law enforcement would love to push a button with that video and pull out the name of the person that most closely matched that gait cycle. So there are good uses of it. People will put information into the internet for the pure joy of doing it, right? And that's generally good. It's good in the case of Wikipedia, certainly. But talk about lame. I don't know, maybe some of you have done this. You know about Where's George? Everybody used Where's George? Where's George is a site where you can take a dollar bill out of your pocket and type in the serial number on the dollar bill and have it tell you all of the other people who have seen that dollar bill and have gone to the Where's George site and logged it. So I don't know, this is not my idea of fun every time I get a dollar bill to go type a 25-digit number into the computer, but people will do it. People will do it. And so they will do all of these other identifying tasks. This is the hive. This is the hive. And so when Hillary says, access to information helps citizens, more freely information flows, the stronger it becomes, you start to wonder, is that really true, or is data going to be something like fertilizer, which it's fine for people to have but they can't have too much of it because you can make bombs out of it, right? Does the very fact of accumulated information start to be threatening? So that's my fertilizer thing. And you read what the rules are about fertilizer. These are from New York State, I think. You have to provide proper identification if you're going to have too much of it. You know, it has to be available for inspection to see if you're doing anything bad with it. It has to be stored in a secure location. So, you know, you can imagine data laws that work exactly the same way. Who would have thought 20 years ago that there would be laws like this about fertilizer? I don't know. So there's question number 3. You know, is there a certain kind of information? This is a very paradoxical proposition in the United States, that there should be some kind of prohibited knowledge. But you can imagine that there would be reasons why you would not want to keep large amounts of information, even though every individual datum was public information. Okay, so here now I've got to pause and tell an autobiographical story. Carmen mentioned, you know, that I had a couple of interesting students. The first one was Bill Gates. The second one was Mark Zuckerberg. I have the distinction of having changed the world by causing my 2 students to drop out immediately after taking my course. Right? They both did the same thing. The best Harvard education is the least Harvard education. That's what they proved. Okay. So this story is called 6 Degrees to Harry Lewis. And it's told in one of the books about Zuckerberg. And on January 23rd, 2004, at 5 a.m., Mark Elliott Zuckerberg wrote. And I got this email when I got up in the morning. He'd taken my class a year or 2 earlier, so I knew him. And he writes, "Professor, I'm interested in graph theory and its application to social networking for a while now." And then he goes on, and what he wants is, he's constructed a social network where the links are between people who are mentioned in the same story in the Crimson, the Harvard student newspaper. And because I'd been dean of the college, I was in more Crimson stories than anybody else, so I had more edges connecting me than anybody else. And the point of this website he created, this was a month before Facebook was incorporated, was that you would type your name into his little website, and it would tell you how many hops it took to connect you to me through stories in the, you know, co-mentions in stories in the Harvard Crimson. And he said, you know, do you mind if I make it public? Because you're going to be the central node in this 6 Degrees to Harry Lewis social network. That's literally what he called it. And I responded, can I see it before I say yes? It's all public information, but there is somehow a point at which aggregation of public information feels like an invasion of privacy. That's what I said to him in 2004. And he showed it to me, and my response was, sure, what the hell seems harmless. So you know, I believe in entrepreneurship and trying something, and you know, it wasn't the first social network that ever existed. But looking back at it now, 7 years later, where I'm actually really getting worried about this issue, it's amazing to see that I was thinking about it back then. Okay, so there's my summary on the threats to privacy. We move from the government, corporations, we ourselves, to the hive, which is also known in other renditions as the mob, the wisdom of crowds, and all this sort of thing. Okay, one coda on this thing is that there's another source of identification, which is also scary, which it turns out that our diction pattern in our email and other things we write is sufficiently identifying that the notion of anonymous email and all the rest of that is actually a little bit of a fantasy anyway. So we will very soon, it'll be very hard to disguise your identity, because you're, even if you try to use an anonymous handle of some kind, because your pattern of speech will show through and identify you. Okay. The planetary memory, or should privacy be sacrificed for knowledge? So here we are. This is where those of you who were here last night don't get. I now got a prize, actually. I've got a nice University of Sacred Heart bracelet, which has a thumb drive on it. So to the person who can identify this gentleman, who was an incredibly foresighted person. Yes? H.G. Wells. Hey, very good. Congratulations. You ready? Congratulations. So this is H.G. Wells, and here's what H.G. Wells had to say about all of this that we have been seeing in 1937. He said, "There's no practical obstacle whatever now to the creation of an efficient index to all knowledge, ideas, and achievements, to the creation, that is, of a complete planetary memory for all mankind, and not simply an index. The direct reproduction of the thing itself can be summoned to any properly prepared spot. This in itself is a fact of tremendous significance. It foreshadows a real intellectual unification of our race. The whole human memory can be, and probably in a short time will be, made accessible to every individual." This is an incredible thing to say. This is Google. He's got, Google is nothing but a big index. The World Wide Web is, your web browser, your laptop enables you to get the direct reproduction of the thing itself to any properly prepared spot. You've got the whole human memory can be, and probably in a short time will be, made accessible to every individual as soon as broadband gets spread all over Puerto Rico, which may not be tomorrow actually, but we're going to get there. So this is all perfectly prescient, except for the most important part, this part about unification of our race, right? We actually don't seem to, this access to information doesn't seem to be pulling us together. So the other half of the quiz, see if you who are so good on that one, what was he talking about? He says, this was not science fiction. He says there's no practical obstacle whatever now. Some technology had just emerged in 1937 that was going to make all of this happen. Sorry for those of you who already know the answer here, but you're probably, but it's just too good not to pause on here. Microfilm. Microfilm was going to make all human knowledge, what is it? All human knowledge, ideas, and achievements accessible to everybody on the planet. Well, it's the right idea. So here's the question. Do we want all human achievements, knowledge, and ideas accessible to every individual everywhere on the planet? Can we handle it? I think Andrew Feldmar would say no. Here's what happened to Andrew Feldmar. Andrew Feldmar is a psychologist or psychiatrist, psychologist, I think, in Vancouver, British Columbia. He's a Canadian. He regularly drives the 50 miles or whatever it is across the border into the US for various forms of scientific meetings and reunions. One day he was at the border, crossing the border, and the US border officials pulled him out of line for a random screening. He cooperated, showed him his passport or whatever papers he had to show in order to get in. And the border agent typed his name into Google, and up popped a news story about the fact that he had done research on LSD in 1967. And they handed him back his passport and told him he would never be allowed to enter the United States again. Because, apparently there are laws that people who used or experimented or whatever on LSD are banned from the United States. So, now that may be a stupid law, but that's not the issue. The issue is that perfect memory, which we now have the possibility of, is not the deal that any of us have had with our youth in the past, right? We have all expected that things we did when we were young, they might be remembered by somebody, but they weren't going to be remembered by, a government official at the border. or by somebody from whom we were trying to get a job, or something if they happened 40 years ago. So this is a very troubling question, and there are people trying to do stuff about making information fade and all kinds of other things. You could do anything digitally. The problem is, how do you enforce it or establish it as a social convention or something like this? The irony, by the way, on this guy was actually a refugee from the Holocaust. At the age of 3, his parents left Germany with the Nazis in hot pursuit, and he lived his whole life in Canada, and then he's barred because of this factoid pulled out of the dusty bin by the border officials. So do we really want everything remembered? That's question number 4. Talked about Google Books and their recommendation systems, and for recommending them. And I just wanted to throw this in here because it's an interesting story. I was actually preparing this slide, and the Google Books recommended a random subject human locomotion to me, which is a weird random subject to recommend books to me about. I had no interest in human locomotion, except for the fact that I had been preparing this slide a little while ago about human gait, and I'd done a Google search for it. So Google knows that I'm interested in human locomotion. And they try to disguise it by calling it a random subject when they presented it to me. I want to talk about reading. Important point here, as we think about things like Google Books, that is to say, private sources of literature and science and other forms of human knowledge, achievements, and ideas, to use H.G. Wells' phrase. Let us never forget that any private holder, be it Barnes & Noble or Amazon, somebody actually told me just before class, this gentleman, that he'd been reading my book on his Nook. He'd been reading my book on his Barnes & Noble Nook, and he lost his password, and Barnes & Noble was going to make him pay another $15.95 or whatever it is to go back and read it unless he could produce his password. So, but it's worse than that, because we think of things like these services as being kind of, library or bookstore services, but they're neither libraries nor bookstores. Certainly not, you buy a book from a bookstore, you take it home, and the bookstore has no idea what you do with it. If you keep rereading certain passages or something, the bookstore doesn't know it. But an electronic library or electronic, Barnes & Noble, whatever, knows that. Libraries actually have rules. There are laws in all, I think, 48 of the 50 states that prohibit libraries from releasing or disclosing library records to anybody outside the library, except for the limited purpose of getting, books back if people don't return them. But Google is under no such obligation. If we all start reading, they can track, again, down to the page level, which pages we're turning, how long we're spending on each page, and how often we go back to them. So, and that's all commercially valuable information. So let me just skip over this thing about the copyright law, but the question is whether reading, if it goes online, is going to stop being a private activity. I mean, the privacy of reading is really, that's one of these things that seems to me about as fundamental as it gets. Now I want to talk about anonymity for another moment, which is another great puzzle. I'm a big fan of anonymous speech. We always point back to the Federalist Papers, where Madison and John Jay wrote these papers as an argument for the passage of the American Constitution under pseudonym so people wouldn't know where they are. And there's a very long legal tradition in this country that anonymous speech is legally protected. And the principle on which it's legally protected is that words speak for themselves. They don't need the authority of knowing who the speaker is. They are either present a set of facts and a reasoned argument or they don't. But of course, the amount of destructive anonymous stuff that we see, you just go read the comments section on your newspaper, calls that into question. And this fellow in particular challenges that. His name is Ken Zarin. He's an artist in Seattle, Washington. For some reason, a number of these stories seem to be Seattle, Washington stories. And in 1995, the following thing happened to him. There was this horrible bombing of the federal building in Oklahoma City, including a daycare center and all the rest of this. This is the worst terrorist attack on American soil prior to 9/11. And, massive destruction. And shortly after that, on an America Online bulletin board, some postings started to appear saying, call Ken. And what were you supposed to call Ken for? Well, Ken ZZ03 saying, call me, call Ken. I have naughty Oklahoma t-shirts with slogans on them like, visit Oklahoma, it's a blast, Rack'em Sack'em and Pack'em, Oklahoma 1995, and other stuff like this. And they had Ken Zarin's telephone number. This was not, however, Ken Zarin that had posted it. Ken ZZ03 was just some anonymous creep with an AOL account. And Ken Zarin called AOL and asked them to take the messages down, and AOL wouldn't do it. And then the local radio station heard about this and went on a rampage, urging all of the listeners to call Ken, and then people started driving by Ken's house and throwing rocks through the window, and he had to get a police presence outside and all the rest of that, and AOL still wouldn't take the messages down. And eventually, he managed to persuade the radio station that this was a hoax, and the radio station, calmed everybody down, but AOL was of no use at all. And Ken sued AOL, and it raised a very interesting legal question. AOL said, well, we're not liable. It's not like we're the New York Times or something like that where we've got editors and we write stuff and take any responsibility for it. We're just kind of, the way people say stuff and, it gets out for other people to see it. But if anything, we're more like, the guy with the truck that delivers the newspapers. We don't actually write the newspaper. And so we shouldn't have any more liability for the content of what's on our message boards than the UPS driver has for what's written in the New York Times. And this is a capsule version of a long story. But the way the law actually reads says that no provider or user of an interactive computer service shall be treated as the publisher or speaker of any information provided by another information content provider, which means AOL has no legal liability. And that is, in fact, the way the court decided. I can explain if anybody's curious why this is called the Good Samaritan provision, but it is. Lawsuits seeking to hold a service provider liable for its exercise of a publisher's traditional editorial functions, such as deciding whether to withdraw, postpone, or alter content are altered. So no, no message board or service of any kind has any liability for any of the stuff that's on there if they didn't actually write it themselves. And so this is a very troubling case because it certainly touches the edges of my libertarian instincts about information freedom. And it's kind of hard just to say to Ken, well, just ignore it. All right, just ignore it. It's only words. Well, it's very threatening. So there's my list of questions. I'm about to wrap up here. Yeah, I'm just about on time. Should public information be less public? Would we rather have everyone know everything about us or have only the police know everything about us? Should there be any prohibited knowledge? Do we want everything remembered? Will reading cease to be private, and can we ignore anonymous speech? Two things by way of conclusion. First, we get this argument This is only a transitional state. In an enlightened society where we're all tolerant and respectful of everybody, this privacy issue would go away, and it wouldn't matter if everybody knew everything about us. And this is, so, in an enlightened society, wouldn't privacy be unnecessary? And the answer to this question is no. And the reason the answer to this question is no is because, and I don't think I'm violating my general optimism and utopianism when I say this, that a fully, a society that is that enlightened is probably quite a bit over the horizon. I believe in looking over the horizon, but I'm not willing to sacrifice my privacy totally because I can imagine something that's quite that far out. And in particular, privacy is a socially progressive force. The reason you have private spaces is why it's good for society to have private spaces is because every social movement, probably every religious movement that ever started as a group of people who knew that there were other people who would stop them if they knew what they were doing. And so privacy provides some protection for groups that have, I'm going to use the term, very loosely, socially progressive, and I don't have any political agenda when I'm saying that. I think, Jesus and the apostles were a socially progressive movement at the time, and if they had a Facebook page, Christianity never would have gotten off the ground, right? Because the government would have closed them down as soon as they knew who they were. So any kind of small group that wants a better world, whatever kind it is, needs some privacy in order to gradually persuade the rest of the world that their point of view is right and the existing order is not. So to put it the other way, a lack of privacy is socially stagnating, right? Without privacy, the status quo, you have a tyranny of the majority. Okay, so that's the argument against this argument, which I tend to hear particularly from the young, I must say. Probably not an argument perhaps that others would do. So here's my conclusion now, and about global warming and normative science. So about a year ago, I got an email from a student who had graduated from Harvard a couple of years before, and he'd read my other book, my Excellence Without a Soul book of my thoughts about higher education. And it made him think about why he had majored in environmental science and public policy, which is a major at Harvard. Sort of half environmental science stuff and half political science that related to the environment. And he said that the thing that attracted him about the major was that I thought there was usually a pretty clear normative argument running through the courses I took. So there were the environmental science department is not a politically biased department. It's not a leftist department or a rightist department. But there were no environmental scientists, not one, who thought the world would be better off if the ice caps melted. Okay, they were all anti-ice cap melting scientists, right? And so this is what I mean by a normative science. It's a science informed by some sense of what a better world is going to be, or what a worse world is going to be, and how to prevent it. And this guy had found in that science a set of norms that helped him make sense of his education. And it made me think about the fact that there we have non-normative and normative sciences. Archaeology, I would say, is a non-normative science. You dig stuff up, you happen to interpret it. You shouldn't be interpreting it about the way you think the past should have been. You've got to deal with the past as it actually was. Pure mathematics is a non-normative science. If your discovery gets used you're not responsible for what your pure mathematical discoveries get used for. Historical linguistics, again, it's a study of the past. String theory, matter is what it is, whether we like it or not, and we have an imperative to understand it. On the other hand, there are a number of sciences that are pretty clearly normative in my sense. Political science is normative. It doesn't mean that there's a consensus about how the world should be, but there's, in American universities at least, some pretty clear sense of what the world should not be. Medicine is clearly a normative science. Engineering, actually, and one of the things I like about it is it's about solving human problems. And so we kind of pick our problems on the basis that the world would be better off if we can solve those problems than if we don't solve them. Philosophy has always had a normative element to it, although not all philosophers necessarily agree to it. Environmental science, plainly does. I think computer science has gotten to the point, and communication science have gotten to the point where they should be moving out of the left-hand list where they have always been, and defined by as being a branch of mathematics, study of algorithms and how to solve problems, and has to think of itself more and more as a partner to, having some of the same characteristics as engineering has, and that it's as a sort of information science and library science and in that thing that the values of the dissemination of human knowledge are things that we actually have to think about the values behind what we do as well. So that's my computer and communication sciences, whatever it is, they belong in the right-hand list, and I think that's where we should try to move them. So, privacy has the same normative underpinnings as all of these other principles of human knowledge that we talk about: free speech, government accountability, scientific rationality, and so on. And I think that closes off my lecture. So thank you very much.
Buenas tardes, hasta luego.